Thanks for downloading the Martial Secrets podcast with martial artists and authors, Lawrence Kane and Kris Wilder. Now here are Lawrence and Kris.
Hey folks, welcome to Martial Secrets. I'm your co-host, Kris Wilder. I do not have my sidekick and great collaborator, Lawrence Kane, with me, and I'm going to be flying solo. I'm going to be talking with Jeffery Mann, the author of When Buddhists Attack. Jeffery began, let's see here. Well, I'm just going to go to the back of the book here so you can see what it says. It says, Jeffery Mann, PhD, earned his doctorate in religious studies at Vanderbilt University, or as we call it, Vandy, and is currently chair of the Religious Studies Department at Susquehanna University. In addition, he served as a visiting professor of religion at Senshu University in Ikuta, Japan, and he's a longtime student of Japanese martial arts. He's trained and competed in karate throughout North America, Japan, Okinawa, the Philippines. He's an instructor at the Susquehanna Goju-Ryu Karate Club, and that school is affiliated with the IOGKF, the International Okinawan Goju-Ryu Karate Do Federation. Jeff, did I get it all right?
Pretty much so, yes.
Okay. You know, I got to tell you, the first thing is that I'm a book guy. I like books. I don't own a Kindle. I don't own a Nook, any of that stuff. I love books. And I have to say that this book is, your editors, author, your publisher did a fantastic job on this. I mean, when I look at the cover of this book, I'm like, that's got some heft to it, and this looks very interesting. It's a gorgeous book. You've got to be pleased with it.
Yeah, thank you very much. The folks at Tuttle did an excellent job. The editor I worked with has been wonderful throughout the process, and when I first got a view of the cover, I thought they did excellent artwork, and then when I actually got a copy of it, when they mailed me the copy to have a nice jacketed hard copy book, a hardback book, and at a very reasonable price, I was really pleased. I was really impressed with Tuttle's work.
Yeah, it's great. The title of the book is When Buddhists Attack, The Curious Relationship Between Zen and Martial Arts. Jeff, there's been a million books written about this, but yours is different. And to the point to where I actually wrote a testimonial for it. Would you tell the listeners out there, if they're looking for a book in Zen and the martial arts and all of this, what makes yours different than what else is out there? What are they going to gain from it if they take a read of this book?
I would say that what they would get out of it is what I noticed was missing from the literature when I was spending a number of years reading as much as I could on the subject and getting to know the subject matter better and better. As you say, there are some wonderful books out there. Some have been around for centuries. If you look back to the work of what was done in Japan around 500 years ago, people like Yagyu Munenori and others. And then there have been other books like D.T. Suzuki's Zen and Japanese Culture, which is also a classic. And there have been some wonderful new books out there. But what I realized as I was doing research is, in addition to the wonderful books, there's some less than wonderful books out there dealing with the subject matter as well. But what I noticed was missing was there was no just good basic introduction to the subject matter. If you pick up D.T. Suzuki's book, for example, it's a great book, but for a beginner to start there, it is overwhelming to say the least. And there are other ones similarly that assume a basic knowledge on the part of the reader or focus on certain aspects, like Tyson Deshimaru's work, but just a basic introduction to what is Buddhism, what is Zen, what is the historical relationship between these two. How is this played out in terms of certain ethical questions? How is this played out continually in people's martial pursuits? I wanted to do a good, solid introduction to the subject matter, and from there, steer readers on to greater works than mine by greater authors than I am, so that they can continue to explore this really fascinating topic.
Would you give, all of us, I think, have some familiarity with the Buddha. Can you give us a 30-second cliff note on his life?
Oh, well, you.
I know.
if you,
Okay,
if you ask a,
32 seconds. You can have 32.
yeah, if you ask a college professor for a short answer on anything, you're not gonna get what you want. But I'll do my best to keep it brief. Siddhartha Gautama was a real historical person. He lived about 2,500 years ago, born in modern day Nepal, and spent most of his time in what is now India. And he sought enlightenment and believed that he had attained it. And after this experience, he spent around the next 50 years of his life teaching people what he had discovered. There are different aspects of Buddhism that one could focus on in terms of the Buddha's teachings. And there are different aspects that we look at in this book. One of the most profound, I think, is the very well-known Four Noble Truths, in which he talks about the suffering in the world and the way to overcome suffering by overcoming attachment and desire. But there are also notions of what the self is and what the self is not. And Zen actually, in particular, takes a strong interest in that subject matter. And so, yeah, I've probably gone about 30 seconds, and maybe I should wait and see where you'd like to take it from here.
Well, I can. I remember one time I was having a conversation with my instructor at the time, and we were talking about martial arts and self-defense, and he posed the question, and I think it's a classic question, but he said, "Well, what self are you defending?" Can you take that little statement and tell me, as a martial artist, how I should approach that question and how you would answer that question in your book, When Buddhists Attack?
No, I can't. The reason, the question that your teacher asked you is a tremendously profound question, and is the basis actually for a number of Zen koan. These are these profound riddles that people spend sometimes years studying. The idea of what the self is. According to many Zen teachers, if you understand what the self is, that is to be enlightened, and that is a profound achievement. So if you ask me if I can tell you the answer to that, no, I'd be lying if I said it. But to give a little bit of insight into what Zen wants to convey to people, Zen is very interested in what the self is, and the self is not very often what we perceive it to be. We perceive it to be this static, fixed thing, that the I that was there on the first day after I was born is the same I that is here today, and when I'm 90 years old, it'll be the same. Buddhism rejects that. There is no fundamental, static, fixed self. There is no translucent version of me animating my body. But what is the self? The Buddha talked about these 5 aggregates, things that make up who we are, things like sense and perception and thought. And so to talk about what is the self is profoundly difficult. Now, where does this intersect with martial arts? If you look at the samurai's primary interest, the samurai were interested in doing their job as effectively as possible. And as has often been said, their job was to die, to die for in service to their Lord, the Japanese Lord, not a religious concept of God.
Right.
And so if you are placed in a situation where you can die, we are, as human beings, programmed to want to avoid that, to run away from that. And that was not an option for the samurai. Rather, they needed to prepare themselves mentally to be able to go into death fearlessly, to be able to confront death fearlessly. And how do you do that? How do you cultivate that sort of ability in yourself? It's not natural to us. But a lot of that then tied up with this notion of the self. What is the self? I mentioned a little bit ago that the Buddha taught that we have to overcome attachment and craving and desire. And we have to overcome attachment as it comes to physical things, our wealth, our possessions, even our health. But it also extends to our very life. Your life is not something that you have indefinitely. Your life is a constantly changing phenomenon. And so when you talk about what is the self, if you realize that yourself, from a Buddhist perspective, is a constantly changing phenomenon like a flame, it's not fixed, then you don't become as attached to it. And if you can overcome attachment to your very self, then you can carry out the tasks of life much more fearlessly. And if your job is to go into war, if your job is to put your life on the line, you don't want to constantly be fearing for that, but be able to embrace your responsibilities boldly. And so this idea of understanding what the self is does translate very directly into the life of the mind as it affects warriors of all sorts of different ages and nations.
Everybody's got quotes from, samurai and all of these. One of my favorite ones is if one intends to die, all things are possible. So that falls into what you just talked about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. And if you think about what is going to make someone effective, I imagine I would be a lousy samurai, I'm sure, but I imagine these folks who were living in a situation where they would confront one another in a one-on-one situation. Someone pulls out a 3-foot long razor blade, and you realize that in a split second, if you make any error, even if you're tremendously well trained, your arm is going to fall off, your head's going to roll off. To be able to maintain mental equanimity in the midst of that is a tremendous feat, a tremendous challenge. And if you've overcome your fear of death, that moves one very far down that road to the ideal mental state for combat.
Of course, in America, there's this enormous, it's predominantly a Christian nation. There are many arguments about the founding fathers and so forth, but, the Puritans and, however you want to shape it, unequivocally, it is the dominant religion across the face of America, particularly. Yet, what you find is that you have Catholics, you have, Protestant, and then within those you have subsets. You have, the Holy Roman Church, you have the Old Catholic Church, Protestantism, you have the Baptists, the Methodists, the Episcopals, and it goes on and so forth, and everybody sort of has their spin and their take. Mm-hmm. Same thing with Buddhism?
Oh, yes, very much so. In fact, I would venture to say that you have more diversity of Buddhist thought. We really can't call it theology, but you have more diversity of Buddhist thought, I think, throughout what we call Buddhism than you would find in Christianity. I think that could be my own biases, but I think I'm right in that. If Buddhism, I mean, we can talk about 3 major branches of Buddhism: Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. Sometimes they're referred to differently. And even within them, you find all sorts of, hundreds of sects and schools that have very different understandings of who the Buddha was, what it means to pursue enlightenment, what sort of life I should lead, whether I can even achieve enlightenment in this lifetime. So there's a tremendous amount of diversity. Zen is one of those things that has, I think, appealed to Westerners a lot. Of the various sects of Buddhism, I think Zen is one that has been very appealing to the Western mind for a number of reasons. But that's one reason I think more people are familiar with something like Zen than Nichiren or Jodo or something like that.
What would be the I don't know, the telltale markings of Zen Buddhism?
I suspect what you would have to say is what the word Zen means in and of itself. The word Zen is Japanese. It's derived from Chinese version of that school of Buddhism, Chan, and it comes from the Sanskrit word jhana, which is one of the it's the 7th of the eightfold path. The eightfold path that the Buddha taught, and the word means meditation. The word Zen essentially means meditation, and in Zen, the dominant religious practice is seated meditation, zazen. And so, in terms of what you recognize or what you can see in Zen, seated meditation is very important. And as the the Zen teachers would say, look at how the Buddha attained enlightenment. The Buddha attained enlightenment not at a local temple, not through any sort of worship or admiration of bodhisattvas or Buddhas, but in seated meditation. And so Zen seeks to emulate that. And so that's really, I think, the heart and soul of Zen Buddhism.
Are you familiar with Misogi? You sit in Seiza and you ring the bell.
I'm not sure that by that name I'm familiar with what you're talking about.
Well, I spent about a year doing that with a group. And the leader of the group said something one time over coffee. He said, in my opinion, Zen is doomed to fail. Really? What? Tell me why. And he said, because it has no sense of humor. What do you say to that?
That's an interesting comment. I mean, my first reaction is, if you read the stories Buddhism, I find them rather entertaining and comical.
I think they're kind of more along, what we would call like the trickster, that kind of.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that comparison, but that's a good comparison. I mean, it is true that in a lot of Zen contexts, you find a great deal of seriousness, and I could tell you some stories about how serious things are taken, and there's no goofing around at all. I think a lot of that, and to clarify, my background of familiar is much more with Zen in Japan rather than Chan in China or Son in Korea. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the stories of how the Zen teachers taught some of the classic examples from both China and Japan, I find this endlessly amusing, and I think it's fine, and I think it was as these stories are conveyed, it's intended to result in a certain degree of amusement. I mean, one of my favorite stories that I tell my students, they find this amusing, is the man who approached Master Lin Qi, known as Rinzai in Japan, and asked, "What is Buddhism?" And the teacher responded by slapping him across the face. At which point, the man stood a bit shocked, and Lin Qi's students asked the man, "Why don't you bow and thank the master for the answer he gave you?" And at that moment, he has his realization that what was being communicated, this indirect communication, is that Buddhism isn't about ideas and philosophy and thought and principles. It's about experience. It's about, this is a vast oversimplification, but living presently in the moment. And there's no better way to live presently in the moment than when someone slaps you across the face. And so these shocking stories, I think, are told with, to some degree, an appreciation for their entertaining and comical value.
Yeah, there's not a lot going through your mind when you've been slapped.
Yeah, you're very much in the moment.
Yeah. Looking at, and this is one of my things that I like to do is I like to pick on Hollywood when I can. So now we're going to actually use Zen as a bludgeon to beat up Hollywood. So
that sounds good to me.
Yeah. So saddle in, because here we go. What's the greatest misnomer? What's the greatest disservice the media has done regarding Zen?
Oh, I think that, yeah, I don't know if it's simply Hollywood, but if you watch commercials, there was a yogurt commercial a few years ago with two ladies talking about how good their yogurt is, and they described it as Zen wrapped in karma. I have no idea what that means.
I don't have a TV, so I didn't see that. But you know what? That's as good as Eddie Cohn.
Yeah. And so, I mean, there are things like that. When people use the word Zen, I think if we're speaking specifically about Zen, very often what you find is, I mean, in terms of pop culture, is it's just some way of referring to something mystical or cryptic. And so people say, "Oh, that comment is so Zen," because it was, a cryptic comment that isn't readily apparent. So it's just this vague notion of Eastern mystical wisdom, which is just kind of boorish. So there's that aspect of it. So people use the word Zen and have not the foggiest idea about what Zen is. So it's just this general buzzword. And I actually did a search once and found you can buy Zen shampoo, Zen shoes, any object that you might want to purchase. Someone has attached the word Zen to it, and it's a little unfortunate and a little insulting. But if you look at Hollywood in particular, I enjoy a good, chop 'em up movie is karate chop 'em up movie as much as anybody. But you do have this depiction of the Buddhist monk. This has been repeated over and over from David Carradine and Kung Fu down till today. The enlightened Buddhist monk who is well trained to defeat his enemies, but does so very reluctantly. And there's something really true about that in the history of Buddhism, but it's just a stereotype. It's this vast oversimplification of what's really going on here. So I think that what you get is just a very uninformed, shallow commentary on it. There's probably some specifics we could talk about as well, maybe some specific individuals. But in general, it's just shallow nothingness, and not in a good way.
When has shallow nothingness ever been in a good way?
Well, I realized as I made that comment that nothingness, I mean, I was using it in a derogatory term, but the idea of nothingness, can be a positive thing. The absence of various aspects. It was just sort of a quick comment, but nothingness and simplicity can be wonderful attributes. If you look at the Japanese aesthetics of wabi and sabi, simplicity, and yeah, I guess shallow nothingness probably is generally pretty bad, but there is something to be said for nothing, for absence, for void at certain points and time in your life.
Yeah, well, and oftentimes the world brings it whether you welcome it or not. Let's talk just a little bit about. I want to kind of build a little bridge here between this because and your training, because you've clearly spent a lot of time pondering this. And as a martial artist, and for those martial artists that are out there listening, we always find that we hit plateaus in our training. What does the Zen Buddhist have to say about that plateau?
If one incorporates principles of Zen and the pursuit of Zen discipline, and there are other comparable disciplines I don't mean to discount, but if one pursues this, it's ultimately the mental game, right? This isn't so much about the physical attributes. When it comes to physical training, right, we get older, we get injuries, and we don't continue to physically improve until we're 90 years old. There are aspects, of course, of the physical game, the physical aspects of our disciplines that we can constantly pursue and improve upon. But the mental game for the most part, we can work on indefinitely. We can improve our minds. We can improve who we are at an ethical level, at a psychological level, indefinitely. If you think about when you watch a sporting event, we watch these phenomenal, professional athletes, whatever sporting event we may be watching. These people are phenomenal in terms of their physical abilities, but what we usually comment on after the game is, in terms of their performance, was not how high they jumped or how fast they ran, but rather we talk about whether their mind was in the game. If someone had that good mental game, if someone had that mental toughness to make it through, that's what we celebrate, that's what we respect, and that's what we recognize as moving one to the next level. And Zen can be a means to cultivate the mind. I'm one of those people that, just as a simple observation, when I compete, and I'm not a very effective competitor, I've done some competition and I enjoy it. But when I compete, I'm one of those people who just gets nervous and anxious. It's just who I am. And it's a problem, but it's a mental problem. And how does one deal with that? How do you deal with that in terms of if you're standing in front of 100 people performing kata, or how do you deal with this if you're in an overwhelming situation in society in any context? Where is the mental game there? And I believe that Zen does offer a lot of insight and a lot in terms of the discipline that it teaches to help people develop in terms of their mental game.
You did a chapter in When Buddhists Attack on Mushin and mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
These aren't the same thing, are they?
Well, it's a little bit tricky. I like to think of Mushin and mindfulness as opposite sides of the same coin. For those who may not be familiar, Mushin is usually translated as no mind, and I guess that's as good a translation as one's come up with. Excuse me. I think there's a very common misconception when martial artists talk about Mushin, that they think that it means sort of non-thinking automatic reaction. So when something happens and I just instinctively do the right thing, and so I've trained a certain block for years and years and years, and then suddenly I'm out on the street, something comes at my head, and without any thought, without any preparation, I just immediately do this block, just as an instinct, as a reaction. And we say, I did that with Mushin. That's not what Mushin is about. Trevor Leggett has written some very helpful material on this, and I cite him extensively in that chapter.
The famous judoka from England?
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. There are some concerns with a couple things he's written, but by and large, the guy is fantastic. I really enjoy his work. And what he does a very good job of explaining, and I hope I'm able to convey as well, is that Mushin doesn't mean that there is no thought or no awareness. It's not sort of an oblivious mental state in which reactions kick in, but there's no conscious deliberation. This might help clarify your initial question, if I can go down this route for a moment, is that, Mushin is not an automatic reaction. Because an automatic reaction to a situation, an unthinking automatic reaction, is not the ideal. Because if someone knows you're going to have an automatic reaction to something, they can play on that. They can set you up. And he tells a great story about the one-armed judo practitioner. It's this young man who he only has one arm, and he trains judo, he loves judo, and he wants to compete with his two-armed friends, but he can't really compete effectively and successfully against them because of this physical handicap. So his teacher takes him aside, and when no one else is watching, he trains him extensively in a throw, hizuguruma. And so he works this over and over and over until he gets this as good as he can get it. And when he trains with his training partners, he only works on defense. So he sends him out to the tournament, and when he goes out to the tournament, he goes and performs this throw. Because the teacher knew that the defense against hizuguruma, the automatic defense, is to grab your opponent's arm. So when the person starts to throw, you collect your balance by grabbing their arm. So this guy went out there with one arm. He set up hizuguruma, and automatically the other judoka went to grab his arm. There was no arm, and he actually won the competition that day. And Leggett uses this as a way of saying, look, automatic reaction, automatic unthinking reaction is not the ideal. The ideal is when you are able to process everything around you, but there's no conscious deliberation on it. I'm not becoming mentally attached to anything. So I can perceive everything. Everything that's going on around me, I'm aware of, but I'm not mentally attaching to anything. So if you look at Mushin, no mind, as no mental attachment rather than some sort of obliviousness, then you can see where it actually is the counterpart or the other side of the coin to mindfulness. Because in mindfulness, a good state of mindfulness is when you're mindfulness of that which is around you, not just one thing. Mindfulness is not when I'm focused on one thing, but mindfulness is a general awareness that I seek to cultivate. And so Mushin, no mind, and mindfulness are really complementary, or ultimately, I suppose you could say the same thing, different ways of talking about the same thing. In the one, you're explaining that there's the absence of conscious deliberation and attachment. And in the other, you're showing that there is this generalized awareness and perception of as much as can be perceived. Did that answer the question?
Yeah. So in the Christian methodologies, mindfulness would be considered as contemplative.
Mm-hmm.
What would be the Mushin?
Well, I think there you're using mindfulness. If you're looking at the contemplative tradition in Christianity, for example, mindfulness is being used in a different way. Just as there are other schools in Hinduism and Buddhism where meditation is practiced differently than in Zen. So there are, if you look, for example, in Vajrayana Buddhism, and I'm no expert in this, but from my understanding of Vajrayana Buddhism, many of the meditative practices there are specifically focused on one thing, whether it be a disc or a mental image or a particular deity, bodhisattva figure. So there is mindfulness that is attached to one specific narrow thing. And in the contemplative tradition, if you're meditating, for example, on the sufferings of Christ, we can talk about mindfulness in that respect. But when Zen talks about mindfulness, it's not oriented towards one thing, but rather it is this sort of passive awareness of one's environment. It's a different type of mindfulness. So in terms of how I can see what you're saying, if you're talking about mindfulness the way some folks use it, then yes, it is quite different than Mushin. But the way that the Japanese or the Zen practitioners and teachers talk about it, then it's the other side of the coin of Mushin or no mind.
what made you walk into a karate dojo?
Oh, the first time?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I had wanted to for many years. When I was a kid growing up, like millions of other American kids, I wanted to study martial arts. I was active in collegiate wrestling through high school.
Oh, yeah, I was a wrestler too.
And I think it's sort of funny that we don't think of wrestling as a martial art, but of course, in many respects, it is.
Oh, yeah, I know. Isn't that odd, though? Because of your social structure within the context of, the school and, and all, it falls into a sport category just as basketball does. But in fact, it's probably, if not the second, it is the oldest form of combative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I sometimes think, when did I start martial arts? I think about when I started in Asian martial arts.
Good distinction. Good distinction.
Yeah. And so I'm not sure that really makes sense. And there are all sorts of debates about what is a martial art, and we'll let that go aside and get back to your question. So, when I was growing up, I loved to watch Black Belt Theater on Saturday afternoon.
Oh, yeah.
All the old Chinese movies. And like any kid, I liked Bruce Lee, and I would play with, a broom handle, and that was my bow, and I probably didn't even know the word bow at that time, and learn how to spin it around. Somewhere along the line, we got our nunchucks, and we played with those, and it's not that hard to figure out, when you're reasonably athletic, how to kick someone in the head. So I just played around with it like a million other American kids and watched movies and didn't really know. I actually had picked up a couple books, and a punching bag from a kid down the street.
Tell me you got the Bruce Tegner books.
The one book that I did get that I remember and I seem to have lost, I'm kind of upset about, is what is that gentleman's name? The founder of Kyokushin.
Masayama. Yeah.
And that was a great book, and unfortunately I've lost it. And I probably picked up a Bruce Lee book or two. But anyway, when I got to college, very beginning of my college career, I was at Kenyon College in Ohio. There was a karate club on campus, and my friend, I had a good friend that I met early on. He had done martial arts before, and he had joined the club, so he took me down there. I thought, this is great. I'm going to have all sorts of fun. And we met in the racquetball court, and I remember the very first day, I was going down probably wearing sweatpants and a T-shirt, and he took me there. There were a couple people already in the room, and he said, okay, now what you want to do is you want to walk into the doorway, bow, and say, us. And I just looked at him like, you're making this up, aren't you? What does us mean? He said, I don't know. You're just supposed to say it when you walk in. And I thought he was just messing with me, trying to make me just do something stupid on my first day. But I went in, and that was really the start of it. I loved it. We were really pretty bad through college looking back. But I trained 6 days a week, 2 hours a day. The spring semester I was running track, but before track practice I'd meet with my friend and we would train. And so my knowledge of martial arts at that time was really kind of shallow looking back. But we trained really hard and we worked hard, and I got some fundamentals down. But that's how I really got started. But in terms of really, I think, pursuing a good art with integrity with good teachers, that had to wait until I went down to Vanderbilt. And that's where I met my teacher, Roberto Ship, who was teaching Okinawan Goju Ryu. And I started with him, and at first it just seemed kind of weird, the differences, the place of kata and the way he would teach kata, and that he wasn't interested in this sort of tippy-tappy tag tournament karate. But over time, I really came to appreciate all that he was able to teach me, and ever since then, it's been a road of increasing knowledge and passion, and a path I really enjoy.
What's the one seed that he planted in you that still grows today?
Attention to detail. When I got started, I did not understand why every little detail was so important. Your pinky's out of place. Your wrist needs to be adjusted 5 degrees. This stance needs to be 3 inches longer. Now, he was German, even though his name is Roberto. He's German and from northern Germany, and I'm also a German heritage, and so I thought this might just be his German fussy nature. The Germans are pretty particular about details.
That's why we buy their cars.
Yeah, and the other people's cars that we buy, the Japanese.
Yeah.
But this attention to detail, at first I thought it was just some fussiness. But I eventually came to realize is, he didn't always bother to explain every correction. But over time you realize, oh, that's why we do that. That's why that's important. I'm glad I've been training it correctly because now it's been instilled in me and built into my muscle memory. So I think there's a lot that I learned from him. But attention to detail and how important details are, that's something I'm still amazed with, how the tiniest little adjustment can have a tremendous effect on one's technique.
We were talking about, Zen, the argument whether it has humor or not and so forth. And, a lot of people look at a karate dojo and they see, austerity. And, clearly that's the way it's presented in the postcard pictures of it and so forth. But there's also a lot of other things that go on in there. And, there's friendships that are built and sometimes lifelong and so forth. But one of the things that I think is really, talking about the other side of the coin as you did, is the humor that comes out of these trainings. And so what I want you to do is I want you to take a moment, think about the funniest thing you ever saw happen in the dojo, and tell our listeners.
Oh, wow. You should have warned me about that question. The funniest thing I ever saw in the dojo, or any sort of, I guess, training context.
Yeah.
Oh, man. I got to look back over quite a number of years.
While you're talking about that, this one, I'll tell just a little one, is
okay.
I was at this tournament back in 80, I'm going to say maybe 81, and I was in Idaho. And at this time, the kama, the sickle was still quite exotic to me, and was, I had never really seen anybody use it. And this guy got out there and just did this just beautiful kata. Well, I'm in the locker room, and he's several years older than me, and advanced rank. And I said, it's just. And he goes, yeah, I don't think I'm going to be doing that anymore. And I said, why? And he held out his hands, and he had all of these little puncture wounds and slices on his hands, and he's like, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah, that's I've played a little bit with kama, and I had some nice ones from Japan with a plastic cover over the blades, and I usually just left that on. So I did have one that just came to mind. I don't know if this is the most interesting, and this may not be comical to other people, but it was to me. This was about, how old am I now? 20 years ago. In my summers, I'd spend some time over in Trenton, New Jersey, training in Hapkido. And we went to our Hapkido school, went to a tournament in Atlantic City. And it was one of those big, popular karate tournaments. It was a fundraiser for cancer research, and it was a good program. And my teacher back then, my Hapkido instructor, very serious guy. I always liked and respected him, but always very serious, always had a very stern look on his face. Good teacher, but one of these just classic stern martial arts teachers. He would smile sometimes. Anyway, prior to the tournament, they put on this little demonstration, and they did some martial arts gimmicks. There was one person putting the motorcycle spokes through his arms and hanging buckets of water and standing on sword blades, that sort of thing. And another gentleman came up, and he got about a dozen kids. And I had them all crouched down, on their elbows and knees in a line, and then people at the end holding the board. And he launched himself across all 12 or whatever kids to do a flying sidekick into this, 2 boards or something like that, and misjudged and hit the people who were holding the boards and fell down on the last couple of kids, which was mildly amusing. But my instructor just burst out laughing, and I had never seen him laugh or act that way. It was just, he found the whole thing just so, comical and amusing. And I think it was, the contrast between what martial arts should be and what it had become, and how people try to impress folks. And when it all fell apart, he just busted a gut, and it was just a very surprising and, to me, amusing situation.
No, I can appreciate that. I know exactly what you're talking about. I was a similar thing. I was coming back from France with my my sensei, and it was a small flight, and they had started putting up these like candid camera. They were like little movies, and they were like candid camera stuff, but they were done in mime and pantomime, so that there was no language barrier,
Mm-hmm.
and they would like scare people, by like having a puppet in the public toilet or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
and react. And I thought he was going to wet himself laughing at that, because he just thought that was. And I thought to myself, this man needs to see the Three Stooges. If he thinks this is funny, he's
Mm-hmm.
gonna love that.
Mhm. But you do find a lot of that in Japanese culture. I mean, and maybe this was a Japanese program you're watching, but the Japanese sort of version of candid camera or punked or whatever it is, they do some really off the wall stuff.
Oh yeah.
Things that you couldn't get away with in the United States at all. I love watching them on YouTube. But it points again to this rather interesting contrast in Japanese culture, and you find this also in dojo life, between this very serious austerity and then the other side of it, which is just this frivolity that's just uninhibited and just general silliness. When I lived in Japan, I trained on Wednesday evenings down in Shibuya, which is in Tokyo, and my instructor there was very senior and a member of the IOGKF, and when we would train, we were very serious. If you got there early and were working out, you didn't chat. There was no chatting during class. It was very serious training. And then after training, then it was community building time, and we'd head off to the izakaya, to the bar, and the level of silliness there, and especially after a few drinks, and then on the train ride home when we would start off all together, it was just this tremendous contrast. And I don't know if that's yin and yang or go and ju, but I think you find that with Zen too. There is this tremendous austerity, very often in traditional, especially Rinzai Zendos. In other contexts, it's life. It's regular people with the same passions for things, and everyone's got a passion for humor.
Well, you'd hope.
Yeah, yeah. I guess that was a bit of an overstatement.
I got 10 questions for you. You don't get to think. You don't get to think too much about them. You just have to answer them.
All right, is this going to be rapid fire 10 questions?
Kind of, yeah.
All right, I'll see what I can do.
All right, first one. Mayonnaise or Miracle Whip?
Neither.
All right. Your favorite movie?
Red Dawn.
Oh. Have you ever placed a professional bet?
A professional bet? Does that mean like in Atlantic City, that sort of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've done a little bit of gambling, but not much.
Is it more important to be right or compassionate?
Oh, that's a whole big Buddhist one. Now I got to give a quick answer.
I didn't say you had to give a quick answer. I just said you had to be quick about it.
Okay. To be right or to be compassionate, that I need to figure that out before I die.
Okay. All right. Beer or wine?
Yeah, I'm not much of a drinker either. I prefer mixed drinks when I drink, but if I had to pick one, I'd go with wine.
Your first car was a?
Subaru station wagon.
Not the GL.
Whatever the cheap one was. That was a while ago.
Yeah, it had the weird horn knobs with the buttons on it on the column.
No.
Okay.
No, I don't think I have that. Okay.
Right. Where do you go to refresh yourself?
I sit down and watch a sitcom.
Okay. Your favorite color?
Purple.
Why?
I don't know. Maybe it reminds me of grape-flavored candy, which is one of my favorites.
What is a place that you have not been that you would like to go?
I think the Great Wall of China.
And that's it? You're done? You're actualized? Take me now, Jesus?
Yeah, I'm ready whenever. But I think that'd be a cool thing to see.
All right. You must spend $1 million you have been gifted, not keeping any of it. What do you do?
Am I allowed to pay off student loans?
You cannot spend any of it on yourself or your family.
Okay. Most of that would probably go to my favorite charity, which is the International Justice Mission, but there's a couple other smaller charities that I would want to fund as well. There's there's a shelter for abused children in Manila, the Kanlungan sa Irma Ministry, and if I had $1 million, I would certainly help them out as well.
What took you to the Philippines?
I can't say an airplane. That would just be too snarky.
But
well, my wife is from the Philippines. I've been interested in Filipino culture for a while, even before I met her, and Asian culture in general. But the first time I went to the Philippines, it was to go to her parents' 50th wedding anniversary.
No kidding. 50 years.
Yep.
You don't see that much anymore, do you?
No, and that was about 10 years ago. Yeah.
That's pushing it up.
Yeah, they got married in their teens.
What's the coolest thing you saw in Okinawa?
The coolest thing I saw in Okinawa? I don't know if it's what I saw, but the coolest thing that I did in Okinawa was making mochi in the Zen monastery with Higona Sensei and the head, the Zen Roshi there, Sogen Sakayama Roshi, making mochi with them on, I think it was Christmas morning of 2008.
Well, that would be about the right time, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that was just, I don't know if it's the coolest thing to see, but it was one of my coolest memories.
I remember walking up on the restaurant that's in the tree.
Oh, yeah.
And just going, where do you find, and my thought was, where do you get that big of a tree in Okinawa?
Yeah, no, I rode the elevator, so yeah, but I've eaten there a couple times, which, by the way, in case anyone's going to Okinawa, it's right next to the Budokan. Really pretty good food and really pretty good prices and a great view.
I mostly ate out of the 7-Eleven next to the Budokan.
I think there was a Wendy's nearby, too, or a Kentucky Fried Chicken, I think.
Yeah, it was a Kentucky Fried Chicken, I think is what it was. I was in the market, and I was there with this acquaintance who is from China. And, there's all of the, the snakes, the pickled snakes.
Mm-hmm, yep.
And I said, oh, man, I got to get one of those. I got to take that back to the States. And he put his hand on my shoulder. He says, you're not getting on the plane with that. They're not letting you bring that into the States. And I said, oh, okay. And he goes, and besides, and he picked a jar up by the lid and shook it a little bit, and the snake started to diffuse, and he said, they're not good anyway. I went, oh, we know a little something about this. And he goes, that's the way I grew up.
Mm-hmm. I recently heard a story about a school where some instructor had brought a bottle of that back, and every time someone tested for their Shodan or whatever black belt rank, they had to take a drink afterwards. But after like 5 or 10 years, you just have those nasty decomposing fish corpse settling down to the bottom where people are doing more of the drinking. And I thought, that's a dojo I feel no need to train in, or at least not get rank in.
No. Jeff, for those of you who have been with us on this long-form interview, it has been really great to talk with you. I want to give you a chance to pitch the book here, When Buddhists Attack, the curious relationship between Zen and the martial arts, because I think it's a pretty doggone good book. There's a lot of them out there, and we talked about it earlier, but I think it's on its way to being a classic. I think this is one that you're going to walk into people's homes in 15 years, and you're going to see this book on their shelf right next to all of the other classics, like the Karate Do Kyohan or, Masayama's Sword. So I think you're going to see it there. I really think this is a great little book. Where can people get a hold of When Buddhists Attack?
Well, first I was going to say I really appreciate that remark, and I hope you're right. In terms of where to find it, it's available of course, on Amazon. It's available through Tuttle's website. Amazon, of course, is where most people go. And I was really surprised when they came out with the price. It's actually on sale now somehow through Amazon, but it's less than $20. And
you mean I can get enlightened for $20?
Well, I'm not going to promise that, but you get to read about 224 pages of stuff that hopefully is engaging. I mean, what I would say, if you're thinking maybe this book is for you or for someone else, I wrote this book as an introduction of the subject matter for people who want to understand what is all this stuff about Zen and martial arts. But at the same time, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't just basic intro information so that people who do have a foundation in this, who do have some study in this, would not be bored and say, okay, this is all, very simple introductory material. I tried to make it relevant and interesting and engaging and challenging, even for people who have background in the subject. I was also really happy to see recently there was a young woman who wrote a review of it online. She's not a martial artist. She doesn't really know anything about Japanese or Chinese culture. She's she's Muslim. She's a law student, and she, among other things, blogs on fashion. But she picked up the book. She was sort of interested in religion, and she commented that even though she doesn't have a background in this, she found it very accessible, so that she could follow it and get a lot out of it. So that was really gratifying for me. But I'd say anyone who's interested in the topic, who wants to get the foundation clear, wants an introduction to it, but also wants to, go further for those who do know more about it. I hope it's a book that's engaging for those folks as well. And it's not too dry. I tried to make sure, and you've read it, sort of how it reads. I tell a lot of stories. Some of them are my own stories. Some of them are classic stories from China and Japan and Korea. And so I try to illustrate a lot of these principles, not just give a lecture on, the nature of the self and the 5 aggregates, but illustrate it with lots of examples and stories and anecdotes to really make it engaging.
Fantastic. Jeffery Mann, author of When Buddhists Attack, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.